Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So let's talk tanking today, but instead of specifically on a particular tank and focus such as in my Ultimate Warrior, Dark Knight, and Gunbreaker guides, I want to speak more broadly on the general mechanics and tricks to watch out for whenever you're playing any tank at any time. My goal with this guide is to take someone from absolutely no experience with a tank whatsoever and get them to becoming very comfortable with all aspects of being a tank up to savage rating. But I want to make this series further from just mundane definitions on what everything is and just basic you do this then do that. I will also be giving my viewpoint as someone who has been a tank for Shadowbringer Savage tier raids currently going on. So with that all said, the tips and tricks in here work for any tank at any time, and yeah, I just hope to shed some light on all this. But you're gonna notice something's really weird about this guide, especially for my channel. It's going to be shorter. So actually, at the request of many people, I'm actually going to be trying to divide up this guide into multiple parts. So this video in particular is going to be part 1 of the series. But then that brings up the question of, okay, what are we actually covering in this series? And so for part 1, aka this video, you're going to get a general introduction to what is tanking, what is your job, then what is your DPS, and then how significant are the damages? What exactly is your role actually going to achieve? And this is one that I definitely think is a perspective shift, because I think a lot of new players to tank think, oh, I'm just going to deal weak damage and that I just aggro things. Your job is actually really so much more. Next up in part 2, we're going to go over everything enmity, aggro, and what that means. What is aggro, how to keep track of aggro in single target and multiple target and pack situations, aggro calculations, using your enmity toggle and what that means and does, my personal experiences on aggro management, and then a general definition on what is a main tank and what is an off tank, and your roles and responsibilities in each. Part 3, we're going to be talking about cooldowns, self-defensive, off-tank, and raid-wide cooldowns. And while that might sound like a short part just because I listed that off so quick, this is going to be very in-depth and very important. Part 4, we are going to go deep into mechanics, and this one I might actually break into multiple parts, but we have establishing main tank and off-tank, pulling, single target, multiple target, then we have tank swapping, tank busters, invulnerability and cheesing mechanics, stuns, interruptions, silences, differences between them, positioning, aka follow me doggy, body blocking, raid-wide mitigation, and raw tanking. And then lastly, we're going to end this series on risk management and how to manage crushing failure in situations, because that does happen. Say the main tank dies as an off tank. Say you lose aggro. Say DPS or healer runs off with a pack of mobs, how do you handle that? Or what if you run out of cooldowns? This is all going to be about risk management and how to handle situations as gracefully as possible. Because you know what, even if you've cleared a fight multiple times like Eden 1 Savage for me, sometimes stuff goes bad. This is even if you're really familiar with the fight like Eden 1 Savage, say a co-tank that you're tanking with and you're trying to avert the tank buster because it's a 1-2 swoop. Not that sorry, this is just a random example, but say because of that, the tank doesn't actually pull it off of you and you get one shot and you don't use any invulnerabilities, how do you recover from that? So that's going to be all of part 5. So basically this is slowly trying to gather everyone from a baseline level of zero knowledge and build up stack by stack by stack until you're finally comfortable enough to be definitely a very good savage raid worthy tank. Anyhow, with all that said, let's get into the first video of this series, which is your general introduction. And likewise, for anyone starting something new, first of all, everyone is going to ask the question of, what is the role of tanking? What job or need in a group does a tank player satisfy? Because you definitely fill in a need that is very niche and very important, but more important than you probably realize. What I personally say to new tank players is that your role is to both facilitate and contribute to the optimal destruction of targets, minimizing damage taken to you and your allies in order to facilitate healers also maximizing their DPS. Or in very simple terms, you have 3 main concerns. First of all, and probably most obvious, is that tanks have very in-depth rotations of their own, and that ultimately these rotations are combined together to deal optimal damage to a target or set of targets. This leads to tanks in Final Fantasy XIV dealing quite significant damage to enemies, damage that should absolutely not be overlooked. A great tank will deal out great damage and will push the team to success. The second concern is going to be reducing the total amount of damage taken by the group, including yourself. Do not forget yourself, such as preventing a monster from hitting a DPS and distracting a healer by forcing the healer to run after them and spam heals, which is waste of their time casting heals instead of contributing damage themselves. You also will do other things like interrupting dangerous casts, body blocking painful mechanics, and much more under this second point. Or worse yet, in this area, death of a DPS. That's really bad. Then your third goal is facilitating the optimal destruction of targets, and this can be best represented by explaining how tanks can pull a massive pack of mobs together all into one tight ball around the tank themselves This allows area of effect abilities to hit all targets in this pack, which the net effect of that is dramatically increasing the DPS done by the party as a whole. Area of effect abilities that hit 4 or more targets deal a stunningly high amount of damage. But outside of area of effect, this can involve things like maintaining the boss in the center of the map to give clear telegraphs for attacks that party members can then more easily dodge, such as times shown here in the video footage. But on that note, let's explore the AoE example I mentioned for this third point. Take for example the potency between a Gunbreaker's Demon Slice area of effect ability and their Keen Edge ability. Given the potencies that we see here, Keen Edge will only ever maximally hit a single target for 200 potency. But with Demon Circle, it deals 150 potency per enemy hit, meaning even 2 enemies hit deals 300 potency, which is actually going to add up to 100 potency more than if you just use Keen Edge on one single target. Now in a pack of 4, that is 4 times 150 or 600 potency in only one single ability use. But this is kind of a contrived example, as you will have many more area of effect abilities that scale off of this, as well as many other players on your team also scaling off of this. And this ultimately boils down to the fact that if you pull a giant pack of mobs, it's going to be dramatically more efficient for maximizing damage dealt by the party than if you just did one at a time or smaller pulls. But circling back, we've digressed from the main point here, and let's bring it back. So the 3 main points of 1, dealing optimal personal damage, 2, reducing the total damage of the party, what they're taking, as well as thirdly, facilitating optimal destruction of targets, can be thought of in terms of resources. In Final Fantasy XIV, we can kind of think of our ultimate objective as being almost to optimize damage dealt over time. Or, if we want to put it simply, we want to wreck stuff fast. Let's clear this dungeon fast, or in the great word of memes, ain't nobody got time for that. So under these restrictions, we need to make sure that we keep our resources, better known as our teammates, contributing to the damage over time in the best way possible. We want to keep them on task. We want to keep them pushing their work. So you need to think of all of your resources as being kept alive and happy, focused on dealing damage to maximize your objective, which is clearing it quickly. You want to allow all of your resources to put in the most work possible, maximizing their own damage contributions, meaning that you get through the objective faster. Regardless of what fight it is, this is for the most part the key objectives in any content that you do in this game. And as a tank, you of any role in the game actually have the biggest task in facilitating this. Yes, more so than even healers or DPS, because you have an incredible impact on how much damage is taken, flow of the fight, and your own personal contributions. Well, do you feel important yet? So let's take those 3 points from before. Dealing optimal damage yourself from your own contributions, preventing damage to allies and yourself, and thirdly, facilitating efficient destruction of targets. Yeah, let's take these and state what happens if these are failed. So for the first one, this one should be pretty easy. In a vacuum where only mistakes can come from you yourself personally dealing not enough damage, then simply your own damage output is significantly reduced. This will lower the group's damage per second and slow down the duration of the trial, dungeon, or whatever content you're in, but this one is ultimately not unique to tanks, but it is just as important for them. The second point about prevention of damage to allies, this is something that tanks have the biggest job to handle. Let's suppose that you take excess unnecessary damage by not using cooldown abilities. Or let's suppose you don't reduce outgoing damage from the boss when they use a raid-wide area of effect ability. Or strangely enough yet, let's say that you somehow lose aggro and the boss begins to chase the healer who is now screaming in Discord asking for help. You can view this ultimately as tying up your resources. They're not doing work. The more damage that the party receives, the more the healer resources have to be poured into heals, rather than to actually utilize your healer resource to move forward the current fight by casting something like Stone or Glare. And yes, healers can absolutely do a lot to move a fight forward themselves, as I will clearly demonstrate in a bit. But let's highlight another aspect of healers being tied up and their ability to contribute work that you care about, as in DPSing. Being tied up, which is something that you really do want to avoid. Your personal defensive cooldowns incredibly impacts the ability for a healer to contribute as much damage as possible. The fewer cooldowns you use, the more damage you take, and the more damage you take, the less you have your healer resource actually contributing damage and doing work you want them to do and moving the fight forward, and the slower it will take. Now for DPS, I guess it's probably clearer here. If a DPS dies, the DPS is taken out of the fight, and their resources, their damage that they are contributing to move forward the fight, is completely removed. Or if you're not holding, say, like a pack of mobs optimally, or putting the boss in a position in the field where it's easier for DPS to avoid mechanics and they have to actually stop, then their DPS is completely removed from there. So in all aspects, as a tank, you are worried about facilitating your resources, your team members, your damage. Your entire team does damage and want to maximize everyone contributing. This includes your own rotation specific to the tank that you play, and do not discount it. Your own damage is another resource used to push the fight forward. All in all, of any role in the entire game that has the biggest impact on total group DPS, it's oddly enough the tank. It's oddly enough the tank that has the biggest impact. And that might sound really weird to people, but as a tank, you're never only just worried and responsible for your own DPS. Your responsibilities, as I laid out before, go much, much further than that. Now, before I leave this topic, I mentioned how you should be facilitating other classes to deal optimal damage, and oddly enough I pointed out healers, which people are gonna be like, why healers too? And this is a very common question. A very common misconception for newer players is that healers should only heal and shouldn't deal damage. So let's pull up FF Logs, which is a recording tool that can basically display how everyone does, and let's pull up one of the hardest fights in the game currently, Titan Savage. Now let's filter these numbers by the top 75th percentile of players, meaning really, really good players who have not only cleared this fight, but have also cleared it very well, very quickly, and very optimally. So now looking at this, we can see very clearly that healers are dealing quite substantial damage. Are they as high as DPS that just focus on just DPSing? No. But if you read the DPS numbers, you can approximate it to be about 13k from damage per second dealing classes like Monk, Samurai, Black Mage. So healers will roughly contribute about half of the damage of a DPS on Titan Savage, a fight that stresses healers to heal extensively. But what about healers versus tanks here? Tanks seem to be around 8k damage here. Well, that's going to be about a 1.5k damage difference between healers and tanks on average, although this shouldn't be used as some sort of insult tool. I shouldn't say that. You have multiple different responsibilities as a tank and as a healer, which, as I said before, as a tank, you're not just worried about your own DPS, your own rotation, you're worried about so much more, and likewise, healers are also worried about so much more than just dealing damage. So this shouldn't be used as some kind of, oh my god, tanks are horrible, because far from the fact, and in fact, a poor tank can absolutely lead to not meeting the DPS cutoff, aka the minimum DPS needed to clear a fight. But okay, let's bring it back to the reality. Let's just simmer it down and bring it back to reality. Of course, this is a very contrived example to most players who will never enter Savage content, let alone care to clear it. And this guide isn't just for Titan Savage. I think that maybe sometimes when I bring up these numbers, it is a little too focused on this. So what about we take a look at the most recently released dungeon called the Grand Cosmos. At the 75th percentile of people clearing the recently released dungeon, we can see that healers are roughly 9k damage per second, which is pretty good. And then looking at DPS, they seem to be around the 14 to 15k mark, meaning that healers are doing significantly more damage than just 50% calculation of Titan Savage. Probably because Titan Savage really is, from everything I've heard and experienced myself, really stressful to heal. Or how about let's compare the numbers between healers and tanks. Tanks are about 9.7k-ish, and Gunbreaker is obviously taking the lead by a significant margin here. So, okay, how could this all be taken and interpreted? That fulfilling your role as a tank is extremely essential to not only the survival of the group, but to also how effective your group will be. There is no denying that as you learn more about tanking through this Ultimate Guide series, that you will become an absolutely invaluable member of any group that you're in. So with all of that said, this ends the first part of this series. Remember to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications on when I am releasing new parts of the series and other awesome Final Fantasy XIV content. So in closing, I want to ask a few questions. What are your thoughts on tanking so far? Have you tanked yet? Are you maybe looking at getting into it? Are there any particular topics or mechanics that you enjoy or perhaps really dread? Like, if you're going into a guide video, what mechanics do you really want to see? So let me know that in the comment section down below. I will absolutely be reading that. Anyhow, thank you so much for tuning in, and that's all until the next installment of this guide. Take care and have a great one.